Well, there are the climate risks that we face today. First, and this is a nice NASA map, isn't it? You can see how our planet is heating up over these time intervals, and how much hotter it is today, and that's not even current, than it was back in an earlier era. Then you have drought. Okay, we have a lot of areas, particularly across the equatorial regions in Africa and the Middle East, becoming drier over time, with attendant effects on food and water security. Fire. You know, we all know we have the Australian fires now. We have a fire season in the U.S. that is now almost year-round in California, parts of Alaska. And we have to now have our military serve as backup support to our firefighters in parts of the West. So we have more defense, what we call defense support to civil authorities. Disease is spreading around the world. This is a map on the changes in mosquito habitat. As the temperature warms, as the planet warms, disease vectors are spreading. That's why we see, for example, greater spread of malaria in certain regions, northern spread of various type of diseases and tick-borne vectors. I don't think I need to tell you all here about sea level rise. You live with it every day. You have it. It's part of what's changing in this region. But global average sea level rise, you can see the map on it, here from the U.S. Global Climate Change Program, so that we now have extreme sea level events that were expected to occur once per century, could occur at least once per year by 2050 under all emissions scenarios. So this is affecting us all around the world, but you're right here at ground zero for it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And what that leads to, along with extreme weather events, is flooding. Flooding happening in many parts here at home, along our coastal areas, but not only, and also around the world. And then more intense storms. This one is from Hurricane Dorian. You can see the devastation that's been wrought there. Storms are getting more intense, dumping more rain, higher winds with more devastating effects. What does this all add up to? It's that disaster risks are rising because people are more vulnerable. They're exposed to more hazards with greater exposure in densely populated areas, particularly in coastal areas, and then populations more vulnerable. You see the direct effects of displacement and damage, but then also the indirect effects, economic losses, and then spillovers. Particularly, we now see migration, global migration, increasing because of climate effects and impacts on supply chains. So the disasters also have a cost. Here you can see some estimates of the costs of various climate and weather-related disasters, impacts on the U.S., and the increasing costs that we face just from 1980 till today. You can see how extreme events and extreme storms and flooding have dramatically increased the costs just here at home. Okay, and then I know, so we're here in an area that's dominated by the seafood industry, and many of us all like to eat fish, but the impact of warming temperatures on global fish populations combined with overfishing means that the health, the quality of fish, and the quantity of fish globally is going to change over the next projected time period. So the summary is, all the things we expect to increase in a warming world are increasing. Things we expect to go down, like sea ice and snow cover, our glaciers are melting, our sea ice is retreating. They're all changing. Okay, so let's talk about the threats. What does that mean for our national security? And then what can we do about it? Okay, So we try to look at, in the military, we look at the threats by region, by combatant command. And so we see these are our combatant commands arrayed by the different effects, the different disease vectors growing, warming world, extreme storms. Let's break it down a little bit. It's also emboldening, it's not only affecting our forces, but it's emboldening our adversaries and violent extremists at places around the world. So this is having now a geostrategic impact on the U.S. And the best place to start in telling this story is in the Arctic. That's a region that has really opened up in our lifetimes, a region where we now have to have, looking at upping our game in the Arctic, as former Secretary of Defense General Jim Mattis said, because we have to be able to operate along the surface as well as below surface and in space, whereas we've always historically operated there, but now we see, for example, Russia, this is the northern sea route along Russia's vast Arctic coastline that is being created into a toll road, monetized as a toll road for shipping across the Arctic. President Vladimir Putin has very aggressive goals he's laid out for the tonnage he wants to see in Arctic shipping over coming years. There's also vast energy resources, fossil oil and gas resources in the Arctic that with Chinese and other money, Russia is hoping to exploit. Then you have the northwest passage here through Canada and across parts of Alaska. And Canada considers this to be its internal waters. The U.S. has a different view on it, but it's still more year-round ice-covered and treacherous than this route, which will probably be accessible. And this one across the central Arctic will be the last one to open up. Right now, the central Arctic Ocean here around the North Pole, within the last year or so, was declared a moratorium on fishing. So there's a moratorium on fishing in the central Arctic because it has never been a viable fishery. And it's good that it's protected. The U.S., Russia, China, others signed that agreement. It also allows all the signatories for the next 16 years to do research and observe that area, which means also that countries like China can build their Polar Silk Road now. So you've probably all heard about the Belt and Road Initiative, where China's building vast road and rail networks across Central Asia, South Asia, to give it access into the Middle East, access to energy and other resources it needs to feed the vast economy. But it's also building a Polar Silk Road, let's point it up here, right? With the hopes that it will shorten shipping times from Shanghai to Hamburg and Rotterdam and other major ports in Europe. So that's a potential game changer for China, for the Arctic. Arctic has typically been a place of very peaceful cooperation. We have an Arctic Council of the Arctic 8 nations with many observers, but now we see increased activity. We see Russia entering the airspace of our NATO allies, Norway, Iceland. Greenland is becoming increasingly independent of Denmark, so now we've got a whole other set of issues as we want to ensure that Greenland stays part of the North American Arctic. And what keeps me up at night is concern about a potential nuclear shipping incident in the Arctic in 2050. Let me go back here for a minute and show you on this slide. Okay, so if you look down here, right here, you see that the U.S., Alaska, and Russia at their closest point are only 30 miles apart. This is the Bering Strait. And it was ice-free for only a short period of the summer until the last decade or so. But it's increasingly ice-free and increasingly available for navigable traffic. The Chinese have now sent vessels through there. Russia and the U.S. have long had some vessel traffic in there, but not a lot. But increasingly we see an opportunity for shipping through this narrow region here. So when we look at what could happen in 2050 with Russia has 40 plus nuclear icebreakers now. They're rebuilding floating nuclear power plants. They want to use these nuclear icebreakers to escort other ships through that northern sea route. China increasingly wants to send vessels through there to access liquid natural gas and ship it and other cargo across that Arctic. So we did a little mini tabletop exercise with the National Academy of Sciences and the Department of Energy Lab, Sandia, where we looked at a potential nuclear shipping accident occurring with a Russian nuclear icebreaker escorting its Chinese LNG vessel and colliding in that narrow Bering Strait right near U.S. waters and the U.S. coastline. What would be the impact, and what research, importantly for places like NASA here, NASA Langley and other research centers, what do we need to know about changing ocean conditions, air conditions, sea states in 2050 so we can protect ourselves and better understand how to avert disaster. Okay, shifting now down to Asia, to India, we can look at Mumbai, a major city in India, a major coastal city that already is experiencing a great deal of flooding in its extreme weather events today, and by 2050 is expected to have much of it underwater on a regular basis. So we see that the world is changing there. In Africa, we have a different set of conditions. We have extreme drought across much of northern Africa that is leading to food and water insecurity for many vulnerable populations in that region. We also see that a lot of the violent extremists and the instability in this area, and these are the places where we have U.S. forces deployed to combat those violent extremists in Mali, Niger, Lake Chad Basin, and Somalia are also the places that are most affected by changing climate. Drought, desertification, inadequate water supply, combination of also human impacts, poor water management, overgrazing, and these now forces combined together, and that puts our own forces at risk. Across much of the Middle East and North Africa, you have water scarcity, which is expected to get worse. More populations will be exposed to water stress in coming years. Except, for the few parts of the region that can really afford expensive desalination plants, which are also very fossil fuel intensive to run. So much of this region is going to be water stressed and parched. Yemen, probably the first country in the world to run out of water, also losing a lot, so this war-torn country also running out of water. Places like the UAE building big desalination plants. They're not providing enough water. Egypt in a great dispute now with Sudan over the Grand Ethiopian Dam that Sudan wants to build, which will change the Nile irreparably for the future. So they're multiplying water stresses and water threats across this region. And if we just take a look here at Iraq, we can see even in these areas where we're trying to recover a whole society after having invested much of American blood and treasure in this region, we have a region that's going to be inundated through saltwater intrusion, affecting the water supply in a very serious way.